Welcome everybody to the Scale Up Show. This is your host, Ryan Staley, and I have a very special guest with me today. So very, very unique guest. He is a TEDx talk speaker, spoke about digital technology through the lens of language. He's also the chairman of the Creative Software Association. And on top of that, if that wasn't enough, is also CEO and co-founder of an open source AI company called Weaviate. So I have Bob Van Lujit with me today. Yeah, good. I pronounced it right. So Bob, welcome. Happy to have you on the show, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ryan. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. I love what you're doing. Love the concept of your business model that we're going to get into that we talked about in the pre-show. So before I get too deep into kind of what you do as a company and where you are, let's do a real quick revenue rundown. So I guess like if we look at it, what does your company do exactly? What does Weaviate do? Let's start there.
Yeah, so Weaviate is a software infrastructure company, and then specifically in databases. And what our database specializes on is something called vector embeddings. So it's called a vector database. And the reason that there's a lot of interest right now in the industry for vector databases is because machine learning models output vector embeddings. So it's a way of storing and searching through and indexing data. And I guess the majority of people, unless they've been living under a rock, have heard everything that's happening in AI right now. So, and we are the core infrastructure piece of that. So we're not a B2C company or B2B company. So we work with developers who build AI native applications.
Okay, love that, man. And then where are you guys at in the revenue journey in terms of like the size of the company, funding, things along those lines?
Yeah, so the company is founded in 2019. We launched we're open source, launched our commercial offering in April this year. We are Series B right now, which we did in April, and we have 50 people right now. So completely remote. So it's
15 you said, or 50?
50. So all the way
50. Okay, that's
from
what
the West Coast to Berlin.
Okay, that's awesome. And where do you reside most of the time?
So I'm Dutch. So for me, home is Amsterdam, but the majority of our user and customer base is in the US. So I'm very often in the US. I'm in the US right now, so it's like very often there.
Okay, love that, man. So as we kind of talk through that, like one of the things that I was curious on you, so you got 50, like what's your go-to-market and how does an infrastructure company that's open source grow the business? Like what do you focus on? How do you grow that? Like what's your approach?
Yeah, so we're an open source company, right? So what you do is that you create something that when you start you don't know yet, but that hopefully is of value to people. And then the moment that you figured out what the value is, so for open source, the market fit is basically determined through downloads, users, community engagement, those kind of things. And when that market fit is established, then there are certain things that people need. So we have a so-called bottom-up approach. Bottom-up, and you need to think bottom-up through the organization. So where you start with developers, and then top-down would mean if you go to C-level down. So you have a bottom-up motion, and basically these developers, they need things, right? So they need things besides the core technology. So sometimes that's in the form of features, but that can also be a managed services. That can be the form of certain types of support, all those kind of things. And that's where you build your business around. So a way to think about it is like you have a core. The core is open source. That's in our case a database. And then you have this huge opportunity around it to create a business. So it's focusing on creating value for the customers first. And we also make a distinction between users and customers. So user and the big difference is like a customer pays for something, right? But a user just uses the technology, and a user converts into a customer if they need some of these additional services. But theoretically speaking, if somebody just wants to build everything themselves, they can do that with the open source technology. That's fine. But we have these services around it, and that's the go-to-market model. And there are many ways and many playbooks how you can execute that with open source, and it's very exciting.
So give me like a more detailed example, and not to go all AI on you, but explain to me like I'm a 12-year-old, right? In terms of the type of services that you would provide on top of the open source model, and then like how that's monetized. I mean, that would be great to understand because like we talked about this a little bit in the pre-show, but there's other open source models like Hugging Face and a lot of new open source money that's getting poured into it, especially after the OpenAI situation that happened about a week and a half ago from recording. So we'd just love to hear that, man.
Yeah, so I can lay that out for you. It's a I need some time to do that. So there's like a little bit of preamble to it, but it's like it might be of interest. So there's a couple of things here. So the first thing is that if we just park AI for now, just talk about the open source model.
Okay.
So let's say that you create a piece of software, and the piece of software does something extremely simple. So ignore the fact that it's extremely simple, but it just adds two numbers together. Right? It's a piece of software, it's a function, and if I give like 5 and 6, it outputs 11.
Yeah.
So you make that available. There are two ways how you can do that. You can do that like in a closed source way, or you can do that in an open source way, right? So if you make that available in an open source way, people start to use it. Or they don't. But if they start to use it, you're like, hey, there's something there. People like to add numbers together, and apparently let's assume that it's too hard for them to build that themselves or takes too much time. So they start using it. The beautiful thing that starts to happen with a community that's harder to do with closed source is that maybe the community reaches out. It's like, hey, we're using that function that you created, right? But we actually don't only want to just add numbers together, but we also want to be able to subtract from numbers. And you know what? We just added something to your technology that we can do that now, so others can enjoy that too. That's one thing. And then when it comes to business, is that people say like, hey, it's a great piece of technology, but we don't want to be bothered with running it because the thing is we're very busy and we just need to have uptime guarantees on running this function of adding numbers together. Can you do that for us? Sure, we can. And that you see slowly here organically the business starts to emerge. And this can go very far. I mean, the open source companies that are very well established, they're like even like training programs that you can say, okay, we can help you to make sure that that you make the best use of this function that adds two numbers together through our cloud service. And you know what? We can also sell you some training that you can make the best use of that in your business, and so on and so forth, right? So that is the first thing. And if you have closed source, it's harder to get that input and that help from the community that you're building. It's just harder to do that. So it's just a way. It's not a better way. It's not a worse. It's just a way of doing it. And open source works great for that. Now, that brings me to the second thing. And that is that if you build core infrastructure technology like we're doing, it is extremely hard to do. So if your listeners go like, oh, databases, we might buy a couple of them, or I don't know. Let me tell you, building a database is extremely hard because it tends to be the case that people, the stuff that they put in the database, they like to be able to get it out again. And then they like to read that that's the same stuff that they put in, right? So, and to do that, that's what we call the reliability aspect. That is very hard. So the thing which you start to get is like a company, maybe with the exception if you're like a really big tech company, like the Googles of this world, but the majority of companies, they're not going to build their own database technology because it's very hard to do. It takes a lot of expertise, many years. So there's a very logical thing that people have money go, from their bank account to your bank account for you to give that guarantee that the database is reliable and that the database does what you say that it does, right? So that is how that business model starts to emerge. And we have databases in many, many different areas. So you have like analytical databases like Snowflake, ClickHouses of this world. You have graph databases like Neighbor.js, and then we have vector databases like Weaviate that's specifically working with these models. And it brings me to the third thing that I want to touch upon, and that is if you look at selling software, open source software from a business perspective, one way to slice and dice it up is ask yourself the question like, is a technology stateful or stateless? What do I mean with that? An example of stateless technology is an MP3 file. So if I listen to a piece of music and I send it to you, right, over email, then the value of the MP3 file exists twice, but it might not be the case that you can actually capture that value twice, right? So that's what we saw like in the early 2000s with like the Senate hearings and Napster and that kind of stuff, right? Or if you create stateful technology, for example, a great example of something that's stateful is something like Excel, right? So if you add something to Excel and you shut down your computer and you start it up again, you want to have the numbers and the formula still in there. Now, what are examples of things that are stateful and stateless? Machine learning models are stateless. Databases, AI databases like what we have, are stateful. So that means that the businesses that start to emerge around these open source stateful applications and stateless applications are very different. So for us, our model, our business model, our go-to-market evolves around keeping the state. So people give us money to make sure that whatever they put in that thing, if they start it up again, that it's the same thing. But that is different and more difficult for an AI model, because an AI model has the same properties as an MP3 file. And that is, if I send an AI model to you, Ryan, we have the value twice, but we might not be able to capture the value twice. So the business model that evolves around that is different. That might be around more the, quote unquote, Spotify model, right? So you see a lot of machine learning model providers keeping their model behind an API layer, because then they can keep control over that that model, like Spotify keeps control over the MP3 files, if you will. And that is how these open source businesses diverge, right? So you always ask yourself, is it stateful, like a database, or is it stateless, like a machine learning model? And then from there on, business models really, differ. So then they're not similar anymore.
Excellent, man. I think that was a good summary. So give me, if you could, some like ideal use cases for a stateful model where, specifically as it relates to AI. So like what type of examples could you reference like that in terms of the business world?
Yeah. So what you want, if you build a database like what we're doing, is that you want two things. Ideally both, but one of two things. Or your database is a system of record, where people say, hey, working with these AI models and these databases is so crucial for our business. If we take it out, our business is gone. So it's a system of record. So these vector embeddings and the data, how these AI models stored in the database. That's one thing. That sits in the reliability bucket, basically. So we must be able to trust on your database. Or things like more in the operational side, that people say like, okay, we're dealing sometimes with like 100 million requests a day. We need to make sure that you can serve that your database can actually do that within a reasonable price range. And then the holy grail is both. That people say, and we're dealing with so many requests, and it's a system of record. So that is something. Those kind of use cases are the most important for your as a database company. And the big shift that has been happening in my industry, and bear in mind, my industry is very young, right? I think the vector database category emerged around 2019, I would say. So it's very young. Was that before it was like a displacement service, nice to have, better search thing. But then with the explosion of everything AI, when people start to build what we like to call AI native applications, so not having some machine learning stuff sprinkled over their applications, but have that at the core. Now, all of a sudden, the role of these databases became more important. And therefore, the go-to-market opportunity became bigger. Because people said, like, if it's a nice to have and the service doesn't really work, then people go like, oh, yeah, that's unfortunate. But, it was down for 5 minutes. That's unfortunate, but, who cares? But now they go like, no. It cannot even be down for like, 5 seconds, right? It needs to be up all the time. And people are willing to pay for that.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. So that's some real good insights in terms of that. And it's interesting. I didn't know it was that young. I didn't know it's only been really around since 19. So that's when the company was started. So how did you have the foresight to say, hey, this is something that I need to run forward and create a company about?
So before I started this company, I was working as I had another business. It was a consultancy business in software, obviously. And I was my company was hired by a publishing company, And one of the things that they were asking was like, how can we create better products for our current customer base than just, selling, publications and articles, that kind of stuff. And machine learning, that was around 2016. There were like these new machine learning models, not to be compared with what we're talking about today with the big GPT models, etc., but just the earlier versions of those. And because maybe we can do something with that. So we started to play around with that, look into it. And one thing that I figured out was that I was like, hey, actually you can do search with this. You can better index and better search data. And for your listeners, the example that I always give is like, I mean, if you work with data, you need to store it, but you also need to be able to retrieve it, because if you store it and you can't get it out anymore, it's useless. And the problem we had was that most search was always keyword based. So if I store something in a data object that says the Eiffel Tower is in Paris, I only could get it out by searching for Eiffel Tower, Paris, or a combination of those words. But if I search for landmarks in France, you couldn't find it, right? And these AI models enabled us to do that. And these vector embeddings play an important role in that. And then I was part of a community called a Google Developer Expert community, and I was invited in 2016 to Google I/O. And during the keynote, Sunder Pichai, the CEO of Google, went on stage, and he said, "We're gonna move from mobile first to AI first." And I was like, "Oh, I know what they're doing. They're using these vector embeddings to index data, right? That's what they're doing." And then I was like, hey, maybe there's an opportunity in the market to build something. I was really thinking business-wise. I was just thinking open source project, started to work on it. And then more and more opportunities started to emerge. And then at some point, like, hey, there's a business here. And that's when we founded the business. So Weaviate existed for quite some time as an open source project. And then we decided to turn it in a business.
Okay. Was there any other open source companies you modeled the business off of, like in terms of the creation, or that you found like highly attractive that gave you insight in terms of this, or where did some of the inspiration come from?
I was I don't know if people know this, but there's I'm Dutch, right? So I'm from Amsterdam, and there's like a famous search company also from Holland that started in Holland, called Elasticsearch. And I always
What is it
looked up to
called?
these.
Sorry,
Elasticsearch.
Elasticsearch. Okay.
Yeah, it's a very big search company, and it's also an infrastructure company, right? So and you also had like companies like MongoDB, and I was always looking up to these kind of companies, right? It's like, what if there's like one day I can do something like that too? And so that was how I was inspired. So that's not per se from a technical angle, but more from a business, like building a business that there's something awesome about knowing that you're like powering so many applications in the world, but that you're not like the face of it. So it's like not B2C there. It is always B2B to C. And these, I mean, I'm now in Vegas, right? So I'm at reInvent, and you see all these database companies that are basically powering the world, right? And that is just exciting to try to be part of that and to work on being part of that. So that combination of this whole, back then we didn't use the term AI, we just called it ML. This opportunity we saw with machine learning and building core infrastructure was just very excited to me. So I was inspired by these companies, and I learned from these companies, and I talked to a lot of people who worked at these companies, etc., just to learn like how was that done. And that's just inspiration, for me to build our business today.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I never heard of that search company that you mentioned, Elastic, right? So that's really insightful from that aspect. And there's so many companies around the world. So like, who would you identify as like your biggest competitors then, or people that you compete with, or people that are in the same kind of space as you?
Yeah, so that's actually interesting that you bring that up, because those are the same companies also that I just mentioned. So something that started to happen, and I need to give a little bit of context for the listener, is that these vector embeddings, that's a so-called data type. So if you have text or numbers or dates or those kind of things, those are data types. And these databases are very good at this. But this is a new data type that we started to create our database around. And These companies were pretty quick to, so actually not quick. So they were like, they were just not doing anything. We just started to build a business. And then all of a sudden they saw the interest that especially to the open source community, that people had for our business. So what started to happen was that they started saying, hey, we can do that AI stuff too. And now back to the conference that if I'm now walking down the expo floor, I see these big companies that are my inspiration, telling the same story as we're telling. But the nice thing is that it's like the innovator's dilemma in action, I guess, is that they turn into my competitors, but that does not per se mean that developers see them as competitive in that space. So these incumbent players are big competitors of mine. So it's like it's interesting to see how that's how that played out. I did not foresee that 2 years ago.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, it's really interesting how that kind of plays out sometimes when you least expect it. So like one of the other things that I noticed too is like on your website, you highlight that your solution is the easiest way to build and scale AI applications, right? Like, and that's probably attractive to a ton of people right now. So like, what exactly do you mean by that, right? And is that for technical folks, non-technical folks? Like, who is that messaging for? And then who predominantly do you serve?
Yeah, so this is a wonderful question, right? So it's like a little bit on a meta level, like why that messaging, right? So the thing is, if you build an infrastructure company like we're doing, and then I mean a software infrastructure company, then the question is like, how are we? So there's like this. Are you familiar with this diffusion of innovations model? You have the innovators, the early adopters, early majority,
Yeah,
late majority.
exactly.
Yeah, so this is this distribution, right? It's a bell curve, and then in the middle you have the early maturity and the late maturity. And at the beginning, the innovators that you have, those people are extremely smart, right? They read the literature, they understand what's happening, they know how to find you. They ask very complex questions about the technology, like how does the index, interact with that, blah blah blah, that kind of stuff. They're very smart. But the question then is like, that's all nice and fun, but that's just a very small portion of the audience, right? So of my potential customer base. So the thing is like, how do I get to that bell in the bell curve? And there are kind of two ways to do that if you have an infrastructure. Number one is what I like to call talk down. So they say like, hey, we're the expert. Look at all this complex stuff that we do. It's like, it's very complex. Look at it. But if you want to build AI stuff, just come to us because we're the experts. The other way is to do it is like to have to have a helping hand, as I like to call it, right? So to reach out to people and say, hey, if you want to do all that greatness, that AI greatness, like we're here to help, right? Let us help you be successful. And that's what you see in that messaging. So what we try to get across in that messaging is the developers or our potential customers who go to the website, to get through that messaging, we're here to help through software, to the products we sell them, to the open source things we have, to the educational material that we have, to what our developer relations team is doing, all these kind of things. We're here to help. So what you try to achieve with that messaging, what you see on the website is we're here to help.
Okay. So that makes sense. And so is that more on the technical side or more on the non-technical side? I would guess technical, just based on some of the things that we're talking about.
Yeah, so that goes back to what I mentioned in the beginning of the conversation. It's like you have a bottom-up movement through
Okay,
the
so more like the
organization.
technical developers. I gotcha.
Yeah, but there's something important to bear in mind, right? So if you move up in the organization, right? So let's go from the developers out of the people leading to like more VP level, director level, that kind of stuff. The generations of people that now sit in those seats, they often have a more technical background than their predecessors, right? So people more came from a business background, or like, hey, we know that tech is important, but we have no clue how that stuff works, and that's kind of changing, right? So it's changing now from people who might have, so maybe at banks or something. And I sometimes talk to VPs at banks who did not start on the business side of the bank, but who started as software developers in the bank and learned business stuff and moved on, right? So that means that if in addressing that, these people, they can consume that messaging too, right? So they understand what we're doing, they know what it means, So and that is a big shift that's happening. So if you go all the way back to the big winner of the first wave of database technology is is Oracle, which was very top down, right? So this is
Yeah.
the database you're going to use. I don't care how you do it. That's what you're going to use. These times are gone. It's over. And so the second wave of database technology, where the big winners were the MongoDBs, etc., and even the snowflakes of this world, right? It was like these at the top, these people started to understand we need to listen to our developers because they actually know how to build these products. And now we are this third wave of what we call the AI native infrastructure. It changed again in the sense that the people who are now at like a VP level, etc., don't have that pure business background, but actually have that tech background and later adopted that business background. So you in moving up to the organization, you try to make sure that that messaging is able to capture these people, and they ask different questions. So a developer asks, "How fast is it?" and a VP says, "Like, how expensive is it?" But you can use the same language to achieve that goal.
Okay. So you're taking like effectively like a product-led growth approach that was previously, top down, which makes sense
Yes,
from that
that's correct.
perspective. So like let me ask you. So like there's a lot changing, right? And in this space at an incredible rate. So what do you see as the future of AI in the next 12 months, specifically for business and real world use cases? Like where do you see it heading and where do you see are the dangers and opportunities?
Yeah. So for a long time, these AI applications, also when we started with Weaviate, they were just not past the point of good enough. So people were playing with it, they were just like trying stuff out, but it was just not good enough. And then we got the large language models. And now all of a sudden it tipped over. It was like we're past that point of good enough. So that turned a lot of that, that opened the eyes of a lot of people to like, hey, actually we can build stuff with this. And um, um, uh, I have to mention ChatGPT here because ChatGPT was an eye opener for a lot of people. Like, oh, so this is what we can do with these language models, right? And bear in mind, language models is the one type of model, right? You have the image
Right.
models, the multi-model, etc. So this is one type. So that was like an eye-opening effect. So people went into exciting kicking the tire mode fast. And what was very interesting to see was that the disruption that the models brought to certain businesses, especially on the mid-size of the SME, market segment, they were like, "Oh boy, we have been spending like 2 years on building our product, and now with that Gen AI stuff, somebody can build it in their basement, like in a weekend." Because you have on one end you have the model, and on the other end you have the vector database technology. We combine them together, and we're good to go. So they were the first to move. They were like, okay, we need to move fast because if we don't adopt, we're dead, right? And now the question is for 2024, right? So for next year is like that excitement is there in the enterprise, but how do we make sure that we really can go to production and that we can bring it to their customers as well? Because AI, and I don't mean this, I really mean this, it's like a seismic shift in how we build technology. I don't mean that in a in a marketing-y kind of way. It's really a different way of building technology. And that's all nice, great, and fun. But people, we're in the current, like, in this phase of with everybody in our industry, building trust in the models that people go like, we believe that this adds a lot of value to our customers. So the customers of my customers, basically. And that's where we are right now. And it was the second part of your question that I forgot. So what was the second part of
I
the
would just
question?
say risk and opportunity. So what's the risk, right? So that's kind of like where we're going.
Yeah.
Where you're saying it's transforming businesses, and like some just to give you a little more thoughts in terms of my insight. I'm speaking specifically to agents, right? Because like if you look at the arc of what OpenAI is doing, which is influencing the entire market, is and like just to break it down, and I talk about this a lot, is like they give you the model for free, basically get training data on how people are using it. Then they start monetizing it. And then they're doing the same thing with GPTs. They're giving it for free. They're going to look at what are the best workflows and prompting to create that structure. And then I think that's going to be the foundation for creating agents from that. So they're doing a really good job at like their approach. I'm curious what your take on that is, because I think that's going to create a seismic shift in the way that we work, not just create products.
Yeah. So software is, since forever, software has been the products that the most successful products in software have been very binary. And what do I mean with that? With binary, I mean is that you build your product in a way that the output is A or B, right? And so, for example, if you take the Excel example, if you take cell B5 and you fill in a 6 and you shut the thing down and you start up again, you want it to be a 6 again. It's going to be right or it's going to be wrong. Or if you look at consumer products, I really like what's so if you take, for example, a consumer app as Tinder, the software behind that, just to swipe left and right, that's very binary. So if you swipe to left, then there's a connection. If you swipe right, there's not a connection. It's that's very binary. But we're running into the limits of what we can do with that, the types of applications we can build. So where does the opportunity sit? Well, in everything that's in between 0 and 1, right? So, for example, I spoke with to stick with the Tinder example. I spoke with the ex-CEO of Tinder, and she now started a new business where she's saying, like, actually, we're now building a dating app where you're not swiping left and right, but where the model helps you to find a perfect match, right? It's more, it became more in between 1 and 0, right? A completely new way of, and this is like a tiny, tiny, tiny niche, right? This is just dating apps, right? To look at building these kind of applications. So the opportunity and the risk are the same. The opportunity is finally we got to a stage where we can start to build this tremendous new, world open up where we can build new applications that sit somewhere between 0 and 1 rather than being 1 or 0. That's also the risk. Because the risk is that if you use a generative model to help you write a legal document, that it might make a mistake. That's the risk. And the risk trade-off is going to be, well, how far do you want to, how much risk are you willing to take, basically, right? So, and that's where the trade-offs will sit. So it's the way we deal with the systems and what we are willing to accept from the systems is going to drastically change. Because again, back in the past, it was 0 or 1. So if you had a database, you stored something in it, and if it did not return what you stored in it, then people were like, okay, yeah, it's not a good database. But now the database is helping you to have the model make decisions. And the model might make a right decision from a purely technical perspective, but from you as a human, from a subjective perspective, you might not like what comes out. And that is a completely new way of building technology applications and those kind of things. And we need to, as a society, we need to figure out how to do that, because we don't know. It's new.
Interesting. I never heard anybody explain it in that way before. So that's like a interesting way to approach it. I can see exactly what you're saying, because it is true. Like, it's in the past has always been that 1 or 0 for the most part, and now it's more we're relying on machines to infer what is the best, right? Almost like, I don't want to use this as an example, but like Instagram or Facebook ads, right? Where relying on them to identify, to an extent, right, what are our preferences based on all the data that they collect, which there's pluses and minuses to that. So really interesting. Okay, so are you doing anything on your platform with or do you see a lot of use cases for leveraging agents on your platform or infrastructure or anything like that? And if so, would love to hear like some examples that you see or that you're really impressed with.
Yeah. So agents play a very important role, because when ChatGPT was released, a lot of eye-opening effects with people. They were like, hey, we want to do something too, but now they had a problem, because if you took this large model, and let's say that you have a legal use case, right? And you say, okay, we have a lot of legal documents, but if we fine-tune the model on these legal documents, it just is often wrong and it hallucinates a lot. If you need to train like a completely new model with these documents, we don't have the know-how or the money to do it, because these things are expensive.
Right.
Is there another way to do that? Can we do it in another way? And the answer is yes, you can. And that is A technical term for that is retrieval augmented generation, or RAG in short. And it's actually it's in the definition, right? So it's when you do retrieval from the model, you augment what's generated by something that's coming from the database. And in this case, that works very well with the vector database. So you take a generative, if you build an agent, you have a generative model, you have a vectorization model, and in the middle, you have the vector database. So you run your legal, so if you build an agent to help you with like legal tasks, right? So for example, let's say that you say, hey, I've seen a startup company that is building an agent. I saw that at hackathon, so I don't know if they actually continue with it, but they're building an agent where they're saying like every time a startup does an investment, the paperwork is like in the majority of cases the same, right? So if you take a history of all these legal documents, you run them to a vectorizer, store them in the vector database, and the agent tells the generative model, hey, this is startup XYZ building ABC, write the right documents for me. Then the generative model gets that information from the vector database, and based on that, it generates something. So long story short, that we call it the RAG stack, right? So the vector database and the generative models together. This is when we have Weaviate, right? So you weave the model and the database, the vector database together. That is used a lot to build agents.
Yeah, I can see that definitely, because that ensures that the data it's pulling is not just random crap, right? Makes it's like it gives the viability of like the research component to it. So that makes a lot of sense. That's really interesting. Any other use cases like that you think are pretty cool that you could explain?
Yeah, sure. So the thing that I'm super excited about is actually now what's coming. There are two things. So one is what we call generative feedback loops.
Mm-hmm.
So a generative feedback loop is this. So think about like an agent, but now what we just were describing, right? The flow is, so you have the data, you have the vectorization model, the vector database, the generative model, agent, and user. It's like and you could draw that on like a horizontal line, but you can also draw that in a circle. So where the agent gets an assignment and stores that back into your database. So we actually have something on the website with an example with Airbnb data. So there's Airbnb data that's missing descriptions, or it has incorrect descriptions. So it's like, hey, you tell the model you have access to the vector database. It's full of Airbnb descriptions. Generate Airbnb descriptions or validate if they're correct, and fix it. So the database starts to fix itself. And you might be familiar with the term. I hope you don't mind me saying this on your podcast, but the terminology "shit in, shit out."
Totally.
I really believe that this is an opportunity to, as I like to call, to turn chicken shit into chicken salad, because it's the first time in history that the combination of models with database can fix your data quality issues for you. So that's one thing that I'm excited about. And the second thing is the use cases that are emerging that are not language-based. Images, fraud detection, multimodal use cases. So where you generate something that is not in the same modality as what you put in. So, and we're just at the start of that, right? So I've seen a use case recently that somebody built with Weaviate where they said there was around cybersecurity, where they said like, hey, you have like 3 levels of complexity in cybersecurity. I mean, I'm simplifying with it. One is just, hey, weird IP address comes in, block this stuff. The second one might be malicious software coming in through an email or something. But the third one is like a hacker is attempting to do something, or you get weird emails or phishing emails. And then having a database and infrastructure that helps you solve that, because today that's still done by human beings. That is something that's. I spoke to a company in the US where somebody said like, I have that CTO told me, I have a how do you call it, a customer service team of almost 30K people, and they look in these databases, they answer emails and that kind of stuff. If we can just take 25% away of that with these models, that's exciting because we can help our customers better, right? And those kind of use cases are extremely exciting.
Yeah. It's wild, man. Well, unfortunately, Bob, we're up on time. I could talk to you about this probably for another hour because I love nerding out on this stuff, just like you, as I could tell. So where can people find you? Where can they find out more about Weaviate? Where can they start building on your platform?
Yeah, so it's just weaviate.io. They can start from there. And myself, I'm on all the regular channels, the LinkedIn, Twitter. I would love it when people reach out. So we're very active also on the socials, just to show people what they can build, what they can do. So it's or my name or the company Weaviate, and that's just a search away. We're very very active online, so it will be easy for people to find us.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on, man. This was a lot of fun and appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. And we will see you all on the next episode.